Welcome to the History Slam podcast from ActiveHistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham coming at you today nearly live. We are in Ottawa, Ontario as part of Congress 2015 and the CHA part of Congress. The annual general meeting may or may not be going on right now, and we may or may not be at it right now. And I'm excited because at the CHA, for me, one of the things I always like to do is try and meet people who I've read before. And we're with somebody who I've read before as part of my comprehensive exams. The first book was Revivals in Roller Rinks, Religion, Leisure, and Identity in Late 19th Century Ontario. And the new book, just about to go to press under review, A Godless Province, Religion and Irreligion in Settler British Columbia. It looks at the 1880s through the start of the Second World War. And
the First
World War, yes. And that is the voice of Lynne Marks from the University of Victoria. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks, Sean.
You study religion, obviously. These two books focus on religion. And first off, what got you interested in the study of religion in Canada?
Back when I was an undergrad, I was interested in the question of women's history and particularly working class women. And I was interested in whether they had a different value system and culture from working class men. And religion was a really key piece of that. So that's kind of what got me into it and moving on into my PhD and looking at it in Ontario.
Is there a really big distinction between men and women in their understanding of religion, their approach to religion then?
There is. I would argue there is, and I can talk about it more in BC, there particularly is, but historians have shown that from the 19th century on, more women are likely to go to church, and faith is more important to them. I mean, part of it is kind of a negative reason. What I say in my first book is that men have a lot more social and leisure options in the 19th century than women. They can get involved in sports, they can go drinking in bars, they can be involved in the local firefighters and fraternal orders, which were big, and women didn't have, at least respectable women, and you wanted to be considered a respectable woman in the 19th century, or you were considered an outcast, didn't have most of those options. They had some societies they could get involved in, but most of those societies tended to be associated with the church. So there's not having a lot of options. There's also that faith was important to those women. In the 19th century, most of those women ended up married and with kids. Infant mortality was high. Faith was an important thing if you're, if a lot of your kids or some of your kids anyway are going to end up dying. I don't want to make it again sound so negative, but the sense is that faith was important to a lot of women as well as the social interactions of religion. And when I moved to BC over 20 years ago, I was still interested in religion, but what struck me in terms of the contemporary context was even how much less religious BC seemed to be than Ontario that I'd lived in for about 20 years before. The students knew much less about religion, and I had just left Ontario when there was a big fight about gay adoption and all the morality came out. And whereas in BC, there certainly were conservative politicians, but there didn't seem to be that same kind of religious moral basis. And then I got interested in looking at some of the earlier background to that and found what I think is a really cool story.
Right, because it's interesting that the two books are provincial in their nature, one being Ontario. And I love the idea of I realize that you got your degrees at York and U of T, but the idea of a UVic professor writing about Ontario and the center of the universe. Of course, if a UVic professor is writing about Ontario, of course, it's the center of the universe, right? It's someone who grew up in southern Ontario, right?
Yes. Well, sadly, I kind of thought it was myself when I wrote it, but moving out there has really helped shift my perspective on that. So that's been good.
And Ontario and BC, of course, would be very different in a lot of ways, economically, demographically, and socially. So, of course, it would stand to reason that the religion or the role of religion in those two provinces would be quite different. And it's interesting to me that you were able to pick up on that so quickly once you move there. And do you think that maybe is because you're more aware of it, just because if that's what you study, than someone like me, if I were to just go, I may not be as aware of it?
Yeah, I think that's true, because I think today a lot of people, and certainly people in academia, for most of them, religion is kind of irrelevant. So it's not part of their worldview, whereas because I've been studying it for a long time, I'm more, I think, attuned to it today. And certainly when you look at the stats for today, or maybe I'll use the 2001 census stats, which are probably more reliable. But at that point, in Ontario, there were 16% of people who said they had no religion. And in BC, there were over 36%. And it is higher in both cases today. We may not know exactly how much higher, but BC has always and still continues to be the most secular, and to some extent has alternative religions as well, which I also talk about in my book.
Right. And does that difference in those statistics, does that speak to a certain political mindset as well? I think there's this idea that BC is further to the left politically than Ontario is, and I think generally speaking the perception is that people, the further left you go in the political spectrum, are the less people who I would identify as religious you would find, whereas on the right you have more evangelicals and those sorts of groups. Is that a fair assumption?
I think that's relatively fair. I mean, I'm not a sociologist of religion today, but if I can pull you back to the past, in terms of what I found about why BC was less religious even in the 1890s up until World War I and beyond, has to do a lot with class politics, with the left-right split that you talked about. So in my period, the numbers are nowhere near as, in some ways, as impressive as today. There were about 2% of the population in 1901, 1911 said they had no religion or were atheists. So that's only 2%. But that's, in Ontario at that point, 0.01% of the population would say they were atheist or agnostic. So it's like 30 times higher. And it was basically unsayable or unthinkable that you were atheist or agnostic in Ontario at this time. Whereas 2% is still fairly significant. And in some parts of the province, particularly in the mining districts in the interior, where there was a lot of radical unionism and radical Marxism, in some areas there it was 7 or 8% of the population who would say they had no religion. And so that's kind of the extreme, the people who would tell the census taker, because in those days the census taker went from house to house, so you had to have the nerve to say to the census taker, no, I have no religion, in the context of a culture where that was not okay. And people, certainly in Ontario and in some parts of BC, could be scared of losing their job for saying they had no religion or they were an atheist. But a lot of other people who might have told the enumerator that they were Methodist or Presbyterian just didn't go to church. And I have a lot of evidence of that. I have a lot of moaning from ministers that in BC people aren't going to church. And I also looked at church records comparing towns in BC and towns in Ontario and Nova Scotia. And Nova Scotia was, in this period, and I think still today, more religious than Ontario. And finding that, again, the people who were actually active members of the church were far fewer in BC. And again, in the more radical areas, because in this period, in my period, you've got a resource frontier where there's a lot of mining, there's a lot of logging, so there's a lot of exploitation of workers, really, right? There's the hard rock mines in the interior, in the Kootenays, where Nelson, Rossland, and there's a lot of coal mining on Vancouver Island, where Nanaimo is, and some coal mining around Fernie and so forth in the interior as well. And there were big labor struggles between the workers and the employers there. And so there were Marxist unions. The Western Federation of Miners was very left-wing. And a lot of the Marxists in that time said that religion was, Marx, the opiate of the people, and then said that, why would anyone believe in God, believe in Christianity. The churches were on the side of the employers, and there was a lot of that kind of rhetoric. And it seemed to resonate with a lot of people. And there were socialist newspapers saying that. In the Kootenays, there were also a couple of not really socialist, but kind of left-wing independent newspapers that said things like, the character of God is completely revolting. Why would anyone believe in God? This guy, Robert Lowry, who was the editor of this newspaper, would go on and about, stupid clergymen or fat persons who were just getting all the money of the workers and not,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was very anti-clerical. It
Sure.
was very anti-Christian. So this kind of language was happening, and not just in the Kootenays. There were a significant number of people in Vancouver, particularly in the working class areas, who also didn't go to church,
Mm-hmm.
who also said they were religious. I need to be careful. Like, in BC, in this period, more people were going to church for sure than are
Right.
going now.
Sure.
Way more
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
But still, compared to Ontario at this time, unbelief was something that was much more accepted, and not going to church was also much more accepted. And again, particularly for men.
Right. And you mentioned the economic part of this, is that in BC you have a lot of people who are involved in primary resources and sort of these outdoor vocations. Whereas in Ontario, or at least in the urban parts of Ontario, I would assume you still have this Victorian ideal of maybe the white class or the white collar workers who aren't working outside and have more time for leisure, as you talk about in the first book, and that religion could be a part of that, and that going to church on Sunday is part of their leisure activity, and perhaps even for, say, a salesperson, part of their business, because you can network, and here's a chance to get to know people. And how much of the economic situation and the differences between the two provinces speak to the difference in attendance of church? Because belief, of course, is a personal thing, and just because you don't go to church every week doesn't necessarily mean you don't believe. Vice versa, just because you go to church every week doesn't necessarily mean you believe. So, how much do economics play a role in terms of attendance?
It's a tricky one, and I'm glad you said that, belief is also in there, because there used to be historians who wanted to reduce all church involvement to economics, so I want to be careful about that.
Right.
And certainly lots of people, both middle class and working class in Ontario, and even to some extent, especially in parts of BC, are going to church partly for tradition and partly for faith. But economics is part of it. If you're in a small town, then you want to appear respectable to the community, you want to go to church. Or even if you're going to if you work in a factory and the factory owner goes to church, it can help you in some context to go to church. At the same time, not wanting to reduce it and not recognizing that, your family's always been a Methodist or a Presbyterian, and it's an important part of how you see your world, and it can be comforting and so forth. So economics is part of it. And there is also, some people say, I'm not sure how much evidence there is, but that rural populations, farming populations, tend to be more religious, so not just white collar. And certainly Ontario has much more in the way of farming populations than BC, where agriculture is a much smaller part of the workforce. But that may be. But I also found that when you compare towns in Ontario and BC, there's still much more church going in the Ontario towns of comparable size to the communities compared to the communities in BC. So economics is part of it, and again, the really polarized class relations in BC is part of it. And then I would say that gender is part of it, because BC is very much polarized it's the gender ratio is very, like in Ontario, it's basically 50-50.
Sure.
Men and women. In fact, maybe a slight slightly more women, because a lot of men from Ontario, from Nova Scotia, as well as from England and the States and all over, have gone west, some to the prairies, but many to BC to make their fortunes in the mines and the lumber camps and so forth. So among the non-Aboriginal population in BC in 1901, 1911, about 70% of them are men. And in some areas, some of the mining camps and so forth, the ratio is even more skewed. So you've got almost 2 men to every woman, non-Aboriginal woman.
Right. Within this environment, I mean, we mentioned belief before. I mean, as a historian, is it possible for you to ascertain or get a sense of how many people believe? Because belief is a very personal thing, and people are going to church for different reasons. So within the environment of the late 19th century, I mean, how is it possible to truly assess the number of believers you have?
That's a really hard one. I mean, I can get church membership records and who said they had no religion, but there are some interesting hints you can get. Like, I would say there are a lot of these men in particular in BC who aren't interested in religion and don't have wives or mothers to force them to go to church. But there is evidence, and some of them are clearly Marxists who are very clear that religion is the opiate of the people and they're not interested in it. A lot of others, they're working hard in the mines and logging camps. They don't have families or families there, so they go drinking, they go gambling, they go to brothels.
Right.
And so that's sort of their leisure culture. So they're not going to be comfortable or interested in going to church when they're leading that life, and they're really annoyed often with the churches that try to close down gambling and close down the saloon. Yeah. So all that having been said, but there's evidence from missionaries who are trying to convert them, and to sometimes from the men themselves, what they write, that, for instance, the missionaries say, if you have a service, the men are quite interested in the hymns. Like if you will start a hymn sing, they'll say, oh, sing this one and sing this one, because it resonates for them with what they grew up with. And it also suggests that it resonates with them for some of them anyway, in some kind of personal spirituality, even if they don't want any churchman telling them whether they can go drinking or not. But so they're still interested in hymns. And most of them, not all of them, again, the really clear atheists say, when I die, I don't want any sky pilots. That's what they call ministers. And they'll write that down. But the majority of them do want to be buried with a minister there. There's one minister who said, I buried a miner and his fellows were very grateful because they don't want to be buried like a dog, right? So for them, their humanity also includes some of the rituals of the Christian church. And also some of the families who are there will send their kids to be baptized. They won't go to church themselves, but they still have some link to it. And there's also a sense among some of the men that they basically believe in a kind of Christian golden rule. Like if they look after their fellow workmates, if they're a good person, then they'll go to heaven ultimately. Like that's what they tell some of the missionaries who come, that they don't have to go to church, but that they're actually better people than a lot of the hypocrites who go to church.
Right.
So there's a term that some of them use, that they're practical Christians, that they don't, this guy Lowry said, they don't moan to Jesus about something, but they look after their fellow workmates. So there's some acceptance of Christian, what we might call Christian values, and possibly some form of basic Christian spirituality, while a very serious hostility to the churches as institutions and as trying to interfere with what they want to do for fun.
Right, and those two ideas aren't necessarily in conflict with each other either, right? Because there's a difference between the religion and the personal belief in a greater power as opposed to the institution of the church. And it's possible to dislike the church but be religious.
It is. I mean, the kind of evidence I have is so piecemeal in bits and pieces, it's hard to know how many of those hard-drinking miners actually had a strong personal belief system and how many just didn't think about it at all. But clearly some of them did, and most of them had at least some kind of family, personal connection to their childhoods where they would sing hymns with their families. And so there's at least that link. And then for some, I think there's more than that. But in the time way before surveys of personal spirituality, it's hard to know how widespread that was. But it certainly was part of it. It's what some sociologists call fuzzy fidelity. That people, I know, it's like jargon. But anyway, so that they're not super religious, but they're not complete atheists. They're somewhere on a continuum.
And it strikes me too, as you're talking, that this notion that some of these workers are being exploited, that also there's a fear in a lot of this. You know, these are dangerous jobs that these guys are doing, and the possibility of death is there on a daily basis for them. And, you know, having a spirituality or a belief in a higher power, or that when you die you will go somewhere, I could see that as being appealing for these guys who are putting themselves in that type of a situation.
Yeah, for sure. I could see it, and I think it's there for some, but for how many you don't know. It is hard to know. And for some, they're absolutely clear that this is all nonsense intended to just further exploit the working class.
Right. So. Which is interesting, because I don't want to equate the two, although I'm sure somebody somewhere has. I mean, slavery, right? Slaves looked at religion, no, not all, of course, but in a very different way, and as a way of, you know, we're going somewhere better. And then they used it a lot of times in a way that was very undermining of the slave owners, and used it in a sort of coercive type of a way. And it strikes me then that didn't necessarily then happen in BC in the same way.
Much. I mean, you might remember that I found in my book that it did happen a lot in Ontario.
Right.
That the Knights of Labour, which was a left-wing labor movement, used Christianity very much, even predating what we call the social gospel, but to say that Christ really was on the side of the working man, and that if he saw how employers were using Christianity, he would be appalled, and that workers were the real Christians. And there's some of that in BC, for sure. There's some of it, and in the Western Clarion, which is the Marxist paper that's very hostile to religion, occasionally social gospel people write in and say Christ is on the side of the workers and so forth. But that seems much less of the mainstream left-wing position in BC. And again, I'm not saying it's not there. And while most of the churches, like the workers weren't wrong, were supporting the employers who paid for their churches and supported them, there were a few ministers who, in times of strikes, like in Nanaimo or Rossland when there were big strikes, there were a couple of ministers who were willing to speak out on the side of the workers and talk about Christianity in terms of justice, social justice and fairness. So it's more complicated.
Sure.
But there was less of this Christianity on the side of the workers and social gospel, Christian social justice. It was more stark in terms of Christianity is against workers, and so we don't care about Christianity. Sure.
And I guess the other element of this is the interactions of these workers and with the state, and how state policies with regards to working conditions would relate then to the religious institutions. And, you know, if part of the rejection of religion would have to do with this idea of, well, you know, if we're organizing, we'll go to the state, get things done that way, and then the religious we don't need the religious institution to get this done, and therefore there's a rejection of it in that sense. You know, it hasn't been effective for us, then let's try a different route. I mean, how does the state play a role in this?
Well, the state is interesting in that, if you know, in terms of BC political and labor history, because workers were concentrated in certain areas, both in Nanaimo and in the Kootenays, they were able to get either socialist MLAs or at least labor MLAs elected, who in the late 19th and early 20th century sometimes held the balance of power and were able to get major legislation like the 8-hour day and also banning Asian workers from the mines because the white working class was very racist. But what they saw as legislation in their favor passed. So they would go directly to the state. And the state had an interesting relationship to the churches in this period because women didn't have the vote. Right. Way more women in BC are going to the churches than men, and actually that's something I talk about a lot. Like if you have a town where there's 80% men and 20% women, in a lot of those small communities, women are still the majority in the churches. So for women, the importance of the churches as for social spaces and for faith in what was, they were a minority, they were in a strange place. The churches clearly were still important to them in BC. But anyway, in terms of the state, in this period, only white men had the vote. Right? Asian men did not have the vote. Indigenous people didn't have the vote. White women didn't have the vote. So when the churches tried to get the state to pass laws limiting gambling, shutting down segregated areas, which were areas where the sex trade was allowed, or reducing the number of liquor licenses, and the churches kept trying to do this, and they were very frustrated, but they didn't get very far. Because, as they said, the government knows that they're a small minority. They said that. Right. So, and actually, I just gave a paper here yesterday talking about how the churches in BC were very supportive of votes for white women. And, that might have been out of the goodness of their heart, but I would argue it was because they knew the women were on their side in terms of passing the kind of moral legislation that they wanted. So,
now, you mentioned this a couple times, the racial element to it and the alternative religions that exist. I mean, BC is a very diverse place, always has been, with indigenous populations and Asian populations. And it seems so far we've been talking pretty much about Christianity.
White guys. Christianity and white guys.
Yeah. So I mean, let's start with the indigenous population in BC. And, how do indigenous religions play into this?
Well, officially, not so much. Officially, by 1900, 1910, almost all of the indigenous people are officially Christian. There's still a few who are defined as pagan, which is in the census a category. Yeah. Most of them are officially defined as Christian, but you can see that the missionaries are concerned that they don't have a super great hold on a lot of these people, and because there's anxiety in their mission reports, and there's a sense that some of them just became Christians, but they're still following their indigenous spirituality. I don't know if you've read Paige Raymond's work, but I mean, she talks about a group of indigenous people who go to the Chicago World's Fair and actually go up on stage and do one of their indigenous dances, and their missionary is like totally horrified. So that's a fairly major example. But so there's anxiety. There's official sense that they've been Christianized, but there's still a lot of Christian anxiety that they're not. So in terms of the churches, they feel, they have much less hegemonic control than in Ontario, where almost everyone either goes to church or at least not everyone goes to church, but at least everyone says they're Christian, right? Yeah. Whereas you've got these indigenous people who may say they're Christian, but it's very clear that some of them are sincere, and for others it's more of a syncretic. They've taken some of Christianity and they still have their indigenous faith, indigenous spirituality. And then there's Asian populations, the Chinese who are the majority, and then the Japanese increasingly, and South Asians. And they come also with their own faiths with Buddhism and Confucianism, and the majority of the South Asians are Sikh. And in some of the ministers are as hostile as other white British Columbians to Asian immigration. But others say, oh, look, this is an amazing opportunity for us to save their souls, to convert the heathen, right? That was the language of the time. So they set up missions to the Chinese and to the Japanese and tried to convert them. But they found at least at least up into the 20s, they're very limited success in conversion. The Chinese and the Japanese weren't interested. And there are various reasons. One, again, it's mostly young men coming, partly because the government of Canada is not willing to allow Asian women into the country, but also a lot of them are coming and hope to go back home. And so young men are not necessarily in the forefront of being interested in religion from any race. But it's also, the Chinese said to the missionaries, you say Christianity is about love and brotherhood, but the way we're treated here by the white population proves that you're lying. And so also the Chinese who did convert often found that they were ostracized within their own communities. So again, there's in 1901, there's 11% Asian population, and they're not converting. So the churches are feeling like they're not really in control in the way they are elsewhere. And it's actually also interesting that at least, again, some of the churchmen want the Asian population to stay. They want to convert them. And so they're challenging the more racist, extreme statements. They're saying, we need to let them stay so we can convert the Asian population. And also sometimes they're saying, this is not Christian brotherhood, guys. You can't talk like this, So, there's some more humanitarian rhetoric, even if they still see them as heathen. But this enrages the white working class. So it's just another reason why they get angry at the churches. The churches support the employers. The churches don't understand why why the working class is so opposed to Asian immigration. And so it's just another reason for hating the churches from the perspective of the white population. So in terms of alternative religions, another thing that I talk about in this book manuscript is BC today. It has a reputation for being less religious, more secular, but it also has a reputation for all these New Age religions. And that actually goes back to my period. Because in my period, the New Age religions of the time, which included spiritualism, which is about sort of having mediums that can talk to the spirits of the dead, and theosophy, which is a very complex religion that kind of combines Eastern religions and some Christianity, a notion of brotherhood of man and belief in reincarnation. Anyway, it's complicated. And Christian Science, which people are probably more familiar with. All of those religions, the adherents were fairly few in number, but they, again, were much more overrepresented in BC than anywhere else. And there's a fair bit of evidence that a lot of people, again, who might have said they were Methodist to the census taker actually went to spiritualist seances and so forth. So, and the majority of the people who got involved in that were women. So women were less likely to say they were atheists, but if they were fed up with the churches, their route was more likely to become a spiritualist.
So would it be this irreligion that you have identified, is that a Christian phenomenon, that people are rejecting Christianity in greater numbers as opposed to religion in general, that people are flocking to other types of religions in greater numbers than in Ontario or elsewhere in the country, or that people, so the Asian population, the Indigenous population, are maintaining their respective religions in similar numbers? It's simply a greater rejection of Christianity as opposed to religion.
I would say it's mostly a greater rejection of Christianity, or a move by Christians to these New Age religions. But having said that, I would say that the main focus of this book is on the settler population. I mean, there are bits and pieces of suggestions that I've found that suggest that the Chinese population, again, as mostly a young male population, might have also been more likely to leave behind their religion, but I don't have the language skills, and so I don't want to go there, because the census takers say that 10% of the atheists in BC are Chinese, but the census takers are so clearly racist. Like in some particular enumerating areas, I mean, in Victoria in particular, they just called all the Chinese agnostics, and in others they called them heathens, and with the Japanese they might call everyone Buddhist without thinking about any other alternative. So there's just, and there are other examples there. So you can't. It would be nice if you could trust the census, because then you could say the Chinese are leaving religion in the same way the whites. But I don't feel that you can do that given the extreme racism of the enumerators. So I would say it is primarily, to the extent that I can talk about it, it is primarily a Christian phenomenon. Although there's a small Jewish population, and I do have reasonable evidence that a lot of the young Jewish men who are also coming on their own, they will get involved in secular Jewish activities. Like there's a Young Men's Hebrew Association, but they aren't to be found in the few synagogues that there are. So that's a small example where, again, gender, that the young men are not going very much to synagogue. But when you're talking about groups like the Jews or other smaller ethnic groups, then religion is about more than just faith. It's also about having some kind of ethnic community. So that's where I find with the Catholics, to some extent, in some places they have very low church involvement as well, but in other contexts where it's an ethnic religious, like Italian workers or Slavic workers, they want a priest. They want to develop that kind of ethno-religious community.
And I guess too, I mean, with a Jewish community, there would be records that they would have, whereas there are certainly issues with indigenous organizations, because a lot of times those are coming through the lens of white people who are recording those things. And with Asian groups, I'm not sure if the similar situation would take place, or if any records would have been kept for them.
There are actually quite a lot of records
but
for
they
the
would have
Asian
been
population, but they're in Chinese.
In Chinese and Mandarin.
One of my colleagues at UVic, Shangping Chen, has been doing a lot of work on Asian immigration to BC in this period and has found lots of records. And there's the Consolidated Chinese Benevolent Society and so forth. And that organization, for example, is worried about keeping the young men away from the Christian missionaries and develops temples, say, in Victoria's Chinatown, so that they can keep their Chinese young men within their own religious orbit. So, there's some evidence of that, but it hasn't been my focus.
BC is interesting geographically. The topography of the province is difficult. I study radio, and in the 1930s, BC was very difficult to cover the province because, one, it's really big, as are a lot of provinces, but the difference between, say, BC and Saskatchewan is that Saskatchewan is flat and you can send a radio signal for a long way. In BC, you can't, because of the mountains and the valleys and all this. You also have an island where the capital is. And is there less interaction between communities in British Columbia, and therefore is there differences throughout the province, community to community, that might be greater than differences between communities in Ontario, say, particularly somewhere like southern Ontario, where there might be greater mobility, geographic mobility of people moving around?
I mean, there was a fair bit of mobility in BC, particularly among workers and particularly miners, but it tended to be between Canada and the U.S. Like there were a lot of mines in the interior, and a lot of miners were going back and forth. So, but having said that, I would say that I found that there were clearly regional cultures in BC around irreligion. So in the Kootenays, in the interior where these mines were, was where people were most likely to be willing to say they had no religion. Some of that, I would argue, comes from the Americans, who we tend to think of Americans now as more religious, but in that context, certainly the miners were coming up from areas where Marxism was fairly strong. But it wasn't just the Americans. But anyway, so there was this regional culture that was more American and more polarized, and you had more irreligion. And then on Vancouver Island, Victoria itself was not very religious, and the ministers there were very much saying people weren't going to church. And that was an urban culture. And then just up island a bit, there was Nanaimo and Wellington, and that was very much a British working class culture, and more of a family culture, and fewer people were willing to actually say they weren't religious, that they had no religion, but most of them weren't going to church either. So it was, and there was a pretty strong spiritualist component there. And again, your point, if you think you're going to die every day, you're going down the mines. There was, spiritualism was seemed to be an important way for at least some of those miners and their families to take comfort with family members dying.
Yeah. So because that dynamic is really interesting, because there's so much going on that challenges a traditional Victorian narrative in British Columbia, that you would have these different reactions to religion throughout the province, and you
would, but I think you have to be. It's not. But there still is mobility, right?
There's this
Vancouver area that's Gastown that's now all trendy, but was a very much a working class Skid Row kind of area where a lot of unemployed loggers and miners would come. So they might come from the Kootenays into Vancouver, and that area of Vancouver, again, people weren't going to church and were more likely to be irreligious. So there's movement, but at the same time, I agree, there are to some extent regional cultures that have their own particular religious or irreligious take.
How do issues of modernity play a role in all of this? And as more people come, as they finish the railroad, as transportation communications improve, do these issues further cement themselves, or do they start to shift in the other direction?
Depends on what you want to say about modernity. I mean, there's big debates in some of the literature that secularization and modernity are linked, but other people would say not, and certainly in the United States in the last 30 years there's more and more religion, and we're talking in a definitely modern or postmodern context. So linking those two is problematic, but I think my sense is that BC, if it wasn't born secular, was more open to being secular and had less of the traditional Christian norms. They were still here, but they were much more contested here. So you could say there was more of a sense of a certain kind of openness to non-Christian traditional norms than elsewhere, which some people would call modernity and other people would be more nervous with. I'm not looking at the 20s and 30s, except to see that in the 20s and 30s, the number of people who are irreligious isn't going up. It starts to go up again dramatically after the war. So the gender ratios are evening out, starting to even out after the war, and so forth. So things seem to at least not move any further in the direction of irreligion in this period. But I'm nervous about terms like modernity, especially when you're talking about in relation to religion and adherence to religion.
Which is fair, and because there are definitely issues at play, though. But you talk about the roots of it, and I mean, one of the things that, again, a popular conception would be that the first settlements in Eastern Canada were religious in their basis, right? Like there were, missionaries who came over. There was the initial exploration period, but then those first settlements were very religious. And so when you say that BC wasn't born religious, that would be, the people who, the settlers who initially went to British Columbia didn't have that religious mindset, or there weren't permanent missions there.
Well, there were missions in BC, though. The missionaries are trying,
right?
And a lot of the people coming to BC are coming from communities in Ontario and the Maritimes, or even in England, where Christianity was much more institutionalized and established and had been for generations. I mean, there's a saying that a lot of the ministers use that men give up on God when they cross the Rocky Mountains. And there does seem to be a lot of truth in that they are able to, they feel freer of family and Christian commitments, and they come into cultures where that's already the case. So whether that means then that they're more able to be individuals and therefore more modern, and that's an argument that scholars like Alex Owen make about these alternative religions, Theosophy, spiritualism, and so forth, that they are again more liberal individualist and more modern for people who still want spirituality but don't want the traditional constraints of institutional Christianity. So, not sure if that's answering
but
what
yeah,
you want.
It really is one of those issues that, I mean, it's hard to trace, and that origin story of it and how this happened is really interesting, and something that it kind of is counterintuitive in a sense, because so much of the initial colonial mindset is religion, that now you have this place that doesn't have it to the same extent.
And the missionaries are struggling because they want to reimpose it. They feel that their hegemonic power is slipping, and you can see that they're absolutely trying. And I guess also another piece that fits with your argument is that there are people who go back and forth. I found quite a bit of people who go back and forth between irreligion, between saying they have no religion and saying they have a religion, or between saying they're spiritualist and saying they have no religion. So there's a fair bit of slippage there. So again, people who are making their own choices, particularly men, but women also in terms of the alternative, the New Age spiritualities. And so you can call that modernity, but again, there's this concern that, am I talking about the secular is more modern, and that's a dangerous thing too.
Yeah, it is a dangerous area to get into. And it's a really fascinating topic, and the subject of religious history is something that, I mean, I don't do personally, but whenever I read about it, I've always found it really interesting. And it's one of those things that the subtlety and the nuance of it, there's obviously a lot there, and studying these intensely personal things, very unique challenges that certainly don't exist to the same extent when studying broadcasting.
Well, it's a different challenge, but yeah, I mean, I find it interesting, and I think it's been too bad because a lot of historians have kind of ignored religion as being, not totally relevant as, the way the economic world is, or the way other aspects of people's lives. But certainly, I'm saying in BC people are more irreligious, but that doesn't mean you can ignore religion, because it's totally contested in this period, and the churches are really trying, and they're trying to impose this moral reform and so forth, and so it's not irrelevant. It's just much more complicated than in Ontario, which isn't to say everyone in Ontario went to church every day, because I never say that, but just a basic acceptance that Christianity is the culture within which everyone exists is different from when you live in a province where you've got all these indigenous people who are sort of semi-Christian but not necessarily, and then Asian people who are totally not interested, and all these white men who are not particularly interested in going to church anyway, even if some of them have personal spirituality.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I would say is that the one place where religion is extensively studied would be in Quebec. Yeah. And the studies of how religion, and particularly Catholicism and the Catholic Church as an institution, the implications of that and its effects on daily life, that's been studied extensively there. And so would you see so should those types of studies, and that the way in which Quebecois historians and French Canadian historians have studied religion and the way it permeates day-to-day life, even for people who aren't necessarily religious or identify as religious, could the rest of the country maybe take a cue from some of these historians?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so, because in English Canada, most social history, cultural history is still very popular, but most social and cultural historians don't look at religion. And some religious historians do, but then their focus is often more narrow, and they're not always looking at religion in these broader social and cultural contexts. But just your point about Quebec, I was just reading a great new dissertation by Elliot Hanowski, and he's looking at unbelief in the 20s and 30s. And it just struck me as how much more power religion still had in Ontario and Quebec than in either Winnipeg, which he looks at, or BC, which I look at. I have these irreligious journalists writing these newspapers in before the First World War saying God is disgusting, these ministers are terrible, and so forth and so on. And the worst offender, eventually his newspapers were banned from the Canada Post, or what it was called at that time. So he lost that right, and he was upset. But he never faced any kind of efforts by the courts to actually arrest him, whereas Hanowski shows that in Ontario and Quebec there are cases of secularists speaking out and writing publicly who go to jail for what's called blasphemous libel. Because both in Ontario, like we tend to think of it as Quebec because the Quebec Catholic Church is so powerful, but it also happened in Toronto because there were a lot of very powerful Christian evangelicals who felt equally strongly about the need to shut this down. So again, to me, that just shows that the state in BC, there were efforts to impose Christianity, but there was a recognition that it was much more contested and that they couldn't talk about blasphemous libel when you have 20% of the population maybe talking like that.
And like you say, there are bigger ramifications to just people in pews, right? It goes well beyond that, and we'll look forward to the new manuscript, which is being submitted for review, and currently titled "A Godless Province: Religion and Irreligion in Settler British Columbia," which examines 1880s through the start of the First World War, being submitted to UBC Press. And the first book was Revivals and Roller Rinks, Religion, Leisure, and Identity in Late 19th Century Ontario, which has won some awards. Very well-regarded book. And like I said at the start, anything that was on my comps list, I'm always excited to talk about. It makes it more real. So Lynne Marks, University of Victoria, thank you so much for doing this.
Well, thank you, Sean. I always enjoy it. It's fun to chat about this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have any questions or comments for the podcast, it's historyslam@gmail.com. Twitter is @Dr. Shawnee Fever. And if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.